Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be going through the class changes of patch 8.1. And overall, I think players may have expected more changes that they're going to get here. Now, part of that is down to Blizzard really talking up large changes for 8.1 as far back as in beta. Well, instead what we see here is designs that are mostly locked in, but this patch does focus on making some small improvements that are quite welcome, just less big overhauls. Blizzard seem to be quite confident in most of their classes based on what I've seen here, and well, at least with, say, the Enhancement Shamans, it just seems like they're going to kick that can down the road to the next expansion. First up, though, we're going to go with Feral, which is probably a bit of a surprise winner here. Now, they've struggled in a few regards on Live, and 8.1 seems to be focused on rounding out some gameplay issues, so their mastery now affects finishing moves as well as bleeds, and this means Ferocious Bite will be a bit stronger. Now, this is going to be really good for just leveling and general non-raid gameplay. Now, Rip is also a bit different. It now has its damage and duration, its duration scale per combo point spent. So you might be able to do, say, a 1 combo point rip that would do near full damage for 8 seconds. Now that's a lot more flexible, but doing that's obviously less efficient in terms of GCDs, but what it does do is give you more leeway in the spec. Now I don't think this is a bad thing because this spec still does have mountains of optional complexity with things like Blood Talons, and then Rip also has a 20 CP cost down from 30. Now there is one sort of odd loss, and Ferocious Bite no longer refreshes Rip and targets below 25% health. That will be felt in raid encounters. It kind of did remove gameplay though, so I'm not exactly sure what I feel about it, but yeah, that is something that's gone. I suppose I also imagine that when combined with Jagged Wounds, maybe just led to like some balancing concerns for the team. And then rounding it out, Maim costs 30 instead of 35, Thrash costs 40 down from 45, and Shred does more bleed damage, but has had its stealth bonus be reduced. So overall, I think that stuff is good for the majority of players, but the larger changes are found to the talents, so let's hop into those. Okay, the talents. So Sabretooth adds duration to Rip per combo point spent rather than just flat out refreshing it. So as an example, you can't refresh a expertly snapshotted Rip with a 1 CP bite. And then this is down to the first tier replacing Blood Scent, and in its old place in tier 6, we have Scent of Blood, which causes each enemy hit by Thrash to reduce the cost of swipe by 3 energy for 6 seconds. It's basically a new AoE talent that aims to solve that problem where you're kind of just sitting there waiting for energy regeneration with not much else to do in an AoE situation. Now, with the Sabretooth change, that's kind of interesting in how it works with the new Rip, because a 1 CP Rip seems to do full damage per second. Now, of course, you can still just, apply a Rip and then go into a 5 CP, Sabretooth. Essentially, what this gives you is a little bit more flexibility in how the spec can be played. It makes your Rip usage a little bit less punishing. Of course, there's GCD efficiency concerns, and I think that because of the changes they made to Rip, they then had to modify how Sabretooth worked for balance reasons. Next up, and perhaps a bit more controversially, Jagged Wounds has been removed and Savage Roar now takes its place. So Savage Roar now costs 5 less energy, it buffs damage by 10% rather than 15, but the new thing is that it buffs energy regen by 10% as well. Now my read in this situation is that Jagged Wounds was causing design problems in terms of balancing the rest of the spec. Now this change does slow the spec down a bit, and I'm assuming that the new speed increase that's been baked into Savage Roar because of the increased energy regen is there to kind of counteract that. Now in Savage Roar's old place, we now have Primal Wrath. This is a new finisher that damages enemies around you and applies a Rip to them, but the Rip is only for half of its full duration. Then finally, Brutal Slash now costs 5 less energy and does a bit more damage. So overall, we see tier 6 be a AoE row, and you choose between Scent of Blood, Brutal Slash, and Primal Wrath depending on what situation you're in. Okay, let's round it up. So overall, Feral is getting changed up pretty significantly. Now, the core remains intact, but the pacing is very different without Jagged Wounds being there, but of course the energy costs going down across the board, and then Savage Roar giving you some regen does sort of counteract that a little bit. Basically, you're going to be shredding and biting a little bit more than you would have been previously, and I guess you'll be ripping and raking a little bit less. Now, I think what definitely is a good thing is you do have more choice in terms of your AoE flavor. Really, the single target pacing shouldn't be too damaged by this. I mean, you still have like Savage Roar, Lunar Inspiration, Blood Talons, of course, to give you a really involved gameplay experience. I'd say this is pretty much just a more rounded out version of the spec that is still extremely well designed within its gameplay niche, but perhaps a little bit more accessible. So for the majority of players, probably pretty decent. For the top end of players, maybe not as fast-paced a design as they would like. Next up, we've got the Enhancement Shamans. Now, This is rough. Players expected massive changes, but that really is not what we're seeing. This is honestly quite disappointing. It had sounded like Blizzard had larger changes for this spec, but really what we see here does not impact it much. They're basically just making some talent options a bit more viable, and that's really it. It shouldn't affect your gameplay much. Back when I did my class review, the main thing that was a problem to me was the resource gameplay. You gained too much Maelstrom, you didn't really have interesting ways to spend it. Pooling Maelstrom wasn't as possible due to the Battle for Azeroth Enhancement Shaman having a significantly reduced resource cap in comparison to Legion because of the removal of artifacts. Now, look, the changes are on screen, but the point is they don't really matter. I'm not going to bother going into good depth with them because it just boils down to there's some more viable talent options. That's really it. It doesn't change the core problems with this spec, and I don't think this is going to make Enhancement Shamans particularly happy. Overall, from a class change perspective, this is my largest disappointment of patch 8.1. Not because it isn't good, yes, more options is good, but it just doesn't significantly even attempt to address the core problems that people reported to Blizzard during beta, and if you want some more learned opinions, I would recommend the Wowhead Shaman feedback article. Really great Enhancement Shamans behind that, and it'll be linked below. And next we hop on to Elemental. So Elemental hasn't seen massive changes, but there are some. So Lightning Bolt, it now does a little bit more damage while Earthshock does a little bit less. Blizzard's goal was to redouble the fantasy of lightning being important to Elemental, and I suppose also to help balance out their damage a little bit by spreading it out around the lightning bolts, which are a bit more evenly paced. Now, moving on to the talents, well, Aftershock is a bit weaker now. It now works on only your Earthshock and your Earthquake. Exposed elements, which caused Earthshock to increase the damage of your next lightning bolt on its target, well, that has been removed. In its place, we have Earthen Rage. This is now down to the tier 1, and basically just gives you some free damage you don't really have to think about. Now, Elemental Blast, it can also Elemental Overload, which is great. It means Elemental Blast works a bit nicer with your Mastery. Then Ice Fury buffs Frostshock damage by 200% up from 100%, and it causes them to generate 8 Maelstrom, which is pretty great. Next, for the other changes, we've got Call the Thunder. This increases max Maelstrom by 30 and reduces the Maelstrom cost of Earthshock and Earthquake by 10. Very nice stuff for quality of life reasons. I think that this is definitely something I prefer style-wise over Aftershock and Totem Mastery, mainly because I don't love the RNG of Aftershock, and Totem Mastery is just a little bit dull to me. And hey, why don't you just throw this onto Enhancement while you're at it? I mean, come on. Now, as for other things, well, High Voltage is now gone, and then we find Surge of Power being in the place of Earthen Rage, which has been moved down to the first tier, taking the place of Exposed Elements, which has been removed. So Surge of Power is actually quite cool in terms of gameplay. I like this one quite a bit. It causes Earthshock to enhance your next Flame Shock, Lightning Bolt, or Lava Burst. So the Lava Burst will reduce the cooldown of your Elemental, Flame Shock will cleave to another target, and Lightning Bolt will cause extra overloads. So I think that's a pretty cool little bit of gameplay. Then finally, Stormkeeper will now also increase the damage of the Lightning Bolts by 150%, which is of course on top of the buff to Lightning Bolt damage that is already happening. So overall, not a massive amount of changes, but it does seem like the talent options are a little bit more freed up. That said, if you didn't like Elemental, I don't think there's much here to change your mind, and I suppose the converse is true as well. Overall, I suppose pretty solid. But like no foundational changes if people had foundational issues with the spec. Next, Shadow Priests. So Shadow Priests see a decent selection of changes. It's quite clear that Blizzard have been struggling with the inherent downsides of their Void Form design. The thing is, it's really thematic, it's really fun in a target dummy, like thinking back to Legion, but it did run into some real world issues. Now, I quite enjoyed it in Legion, especially because the gameplay was so focused on your Void Form. Now, BFA made that Void Form a bit weaker and less important. Now, this sort of balanced out their power overall, but it did create, in my view, a less fun to play class with a weaker gameplay identity. Well, patch 8.1 ends to undo the core wrongs of 8.0. So Void Bolt now generates more Insanity, and Void Form increases spell damage by 20% up from 10. Your Insanity Drain is also 15% slower. Now, that's the most important baseline change, but we also see some other nice things. So Dispersion is more powerful. It also will increase your movement speed by 50%, which is great. But what matters more, though, is the talents. So Mania has been replaced with Intangibility, which is a really nice heal through Dispersion. More importantly, though, Legacy of the Void now further increases Void form spell damage. Then Lingering Insanity's haste stacks drop 50% slower. Now that's quite large a change for the pace of the spec, and effectively it means you'll be getting back into void form a decent bit faster, after the patch than on life. Then Surrender to Madness is a bit different. Its downtime period of 0 insanity generation is now only 15 seconds, down from 30. Then finally, Void Torrent is a good bit different. It generates 30 insanity over its duration on top of pausing insanity losses. It can also be used outside of void form and does more damage. Now, this greatly increases its value in wanting to stay in void form for a long time, because previously, if you used it with only 1 or 2 ticks of insanity left, then you'd just be kicked right out of, void form after the torrent ends. But now, because it's giving you those, the 30 insanity, there's enough time to maybe get a Void Bolt in and try to stay in Void form for a little bit longer. So overall, I'd say that these are very positive changes for the spec. They're certainly not overhaul tier, and I would not be surprised if Blizzard took a look at this spec again in the next expansion. What I will say, though, is that this is a far better version of Shadow than what Battle for Azeroth launched with, and that definitely is a good thing. You still, I suppose, do have that issue, though, where you do have to choose between talents where, you would have had those effects anyway in Legion. I think actually having Void Torrent be baseline would be quite nice. But overall, Band-Aid fixes, yes, but I think definitely good ones, and I suppose we'll just have to wait and see what direction it moves in the next expansion. And then Blizzard are also adding some insanity generation to some of your utility spells, which, once again, I think is a pretty nice little welcome change. Okay, with all that covered, let's rocket through the other specs. So, Blood gets more armor from Bone Shield to compensate for its Veteran of the Third War nerf, and then Bone Storm has had its healing capped at 15% per tick, with Will of the Necropolis also being nerfed a little bit. Then Frost and Unholy are both getting a survivability buff through a weaker version of Veteran of the Third War. Then on top of that, Frost Death Knights are going to be seeing a slight nerf to Breath of Sindragosa. It's not massive, but it could open up a little bit more options in that talent row. As for the Demon Hunters, well, pretty much no changes, and there's a little bit of change for the other Druid specs. Balance's mastery bonuses have been tweaked, mainly to level out the single target and AoE benefits, and then Stellar Flare has had its initial damage buffed, and then Twin Moons has had its damage increase dropped down to 10% from 20. Guardian is mostly the same, but Stampeding Roar is now a 60-second cooldown, and Intimidating Roar is now called Ursol's Vortex. And then with Resto, there's a slight nerf to Trank and a slight buff to Wild Growth. Moving over to the Hunters, there's really barely anything for Survival and BM. BM has a Barrage, damage nerf, and Survival has a kill command damage buff, but more importantly, Marksmanship is getting a good bit more. So True Shot, instead of giving you 30% haste, it now reduces the cooldown of Aim Shot and Rapid Fire by 60%, as well as giving Aim Shot a 50% reduced cast time. Overall, this just feels so much more smooth than the previous iteration did. Then Steady Shot increases the duration of concussive shot. Explosive Shot is now more reliable and less fiddly because it doesn't have a manual trigger. It just detonates after 3 seconds, which I think is a good change. Now, Lethal Shots, that has been changed from guaranteeing crits to decreasing the cooldown of Rapid Fire, which I think is really, really good for the spec. So overall, Marksmanship, it's still a little bit dull to me, but I actually think these are very welcome changes. Then with the mages, there's pretty much only tooltip changes for Arcane and for Fire. However, Fire does have the duration of Meteor be increased by 0.5 seconds. For Frost, Frozen Orb's movement speed decrease has been nerfed, and the same goes for Blizzard. Now, moving on to the monks. Brewmaster's Black Ox is now a 20-yard range, Mistweaver's Enveloping Mist has got a tiny nerf, and Windwalker's Touch of Death has been nerfed to 35% max health, and there's sensible changes to Touch of Karma. Well, it's talent good karma. It now makes all the redirected damage heal the monk. Now, this gets us a little bit further away from the fun, but admittedly rather degenerate gameplay of the current good karma design. Next, moving on to the Paladins, we see nothing for Holy, we see a buff to Ret's Divine Storm, and a nerf to Divine Purposes extra power component. Then for Prot, well, Hand of the Protector now scales to the missing health of your target rather than you, the Paladin, and this basically means you can snipe heal injured party members way better, so that's a great change. Next, Disc Priests have pretty much just been nerfed a bit across the board because they were doing very well, and then Holy has been buffed a little bit. Now for the Subtly Rogues, we do have something a little bit odd. So Shuriken combo is super strong on live, and initially, and for quite a long time, it was basically just heavily slightly nerfed to be a bit more reasonable on the PTR. However, the most recent PTR build flat out removed Shuriken combo. It's really hard to know if that's going to stay that way, but whatever happens, Shuriken combo is going to, well, either be less powerful or not be there at all. Although Shuriken Storm itself was buffed a little bit. Still, little bit up in the air with the sub-rogues. Then for Resto Shamans, they've got a Chain Heal base buff, base healing buff, but High Tide now is basically just an occasional powerful Chain Heal rather than a consistently useful one. Moving on to the Warlocks. For Affliction Warlocks, there is a slight change. Basically, Unstable Affliction is a little bit less powerful, so a little bit of a nerf to that. Destro Backdraft now is baseline 2 charges and then 4 from the Flashover talent, which is pretty sweet. Moving on to Demonology, well, Nether Portal costs 1 shard and it lasts for 15 seconds down from 21. Now, costing 1 shard means that you can, say, use it quickly after like a Hand of Gul'dan or whatever, and that should allow you to do like a quicker demonic Tyrant follow-up and just generally have more demons out. Now, they're also making it so that imps consumed by the Tyrant have a chance to give you a demonic core, and the Tyrant itself gets a better damage buff from consuming the imps. Now, the Tyrant is then also going to extend the duration of the demons summoned from your Nether Portal, which of course combines nicely with its reduced cost, so overall pretty great. Next, for the Warriors, well, Execute now refunds 20% rage instead of 30% if the target survives for arms, so it's a bit of a nerf to them. Fury has a nice buff to Meat Cleaver, it now just works in your next 2 single target attacks rather than your next 2 Bloodthirsts or Rampages. And yes, this means you could get a big juicy cleave Execute. Overall, quite a nice AoE buff. Then for Prot, well, they've got 5% stamina and 5% more strength from armor baseline, and more importantly, Ignore Pain is now finally off the damn GCD. It does have its own 1-second cooldown, but this is great. It means you can always use it as a reaction even if you have just cast an ability. I'm amazed that wasn't like that from the start, but I'm definitely glad that it's been tweaked to be this way now. So overall, that's it for the class changes. I think that there are, just about everything they've done is positive. The problem, I think, is the Enhancement Shamans. They needed a lot more. These changes do not do anything to address the core concerns with enhancement gameplay. And essentially, it seems like they acknowledge that that's a problem. They've kicked that can down the road. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a large rework to enhancement down the line in the next expansion. But yeah, for the people who saw, as an example, like at the end of beta, that every class was just getting balance tweaks, but Blizzard said, don't worry, we're going to do big changes, or, we're going to do like larger changes in patch 8.1. Well, the thing is, like, even if the Enhancement Shaman had have got Shadow Priest-sized changes, or, just some stuff for its resource gameplay. So that really is a big sticking point, but broadly I think everything else is pretty decent. Of course, we also then have the great things like, utility being off the global cooldown, which is, fantastic. It's sad it was ever on the damn global cooldown in the first place, but it is good that it's finally off. So there you go, that's my thoughts on the class changes, as well as a summary of what's going on for the classes in patch 8.1. Let me know what you think down below. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.